The Mendoza Line is a well-known term in baseball to describe a player whose average is well below standards, specifically below 200. The term has reached outside of just baseball, reaching pop culture and other sports. But that term actually derives from an actual player whose poor hitting became a part of the baseball glossary. So let's look at how Mario Mendoza's biggest claim to fame is a knock against him.
Totally sports-esque. Major League.
At the age of 19, Mario Mendoza was playing in the Mexican League for the Mexico City Diablos Rojos, and his incredible defensive ability caught the eye of the Pittsburgh Pirates, who then purchased his contract from Mexico City. Mendoza spent 4 seasons in the Pirates farm system, hitting 18 home runs in 421 games with a .247 average and a 620 OPS. Nothing really eye-popping, but what was notable was the same thing that got him to this point, which is his great defense. Then after playing 2 games in AAA in 1974, Mendoza made his Major League debut on April 26, 1974, to become the 28th Mexican-born player to make the majors. He pinch ran for Willie Stargell in the 9th and scored the game-tying run as the Pirates went on to beat the Astros 4-3. That year, he was mainly a defensive replacement for the Pirates' main shortstop, Frank Taveras, who was often pinch hit for late into games. He finished his rookie year with 177 plate appearances in 91 games, while driving in 15 with no home runs and hitting .221 with a .510 OPS. He also played 471 innings at shortstop, compiling a .964 fielding percentage, completing 264 of his 274 chances. He also made his only postseason appearance that year, starting Game 3 of the NLCS against the Dodgers, while appearing in 2 other games going 1-for-5 with an RBI. Mendoza played in AAA and the majors over the next 2 years, and in both years, he hit under the himself line, hitting 180 in 75 and 185 in 76, while still not hitting a big league home run. He would hit just below 277 at 198, and in his final year at the Pirates, he hit 218, the second best average during his time with the Pirates, as he finally hit his first Major League home run. He was without a doubt a defensive specialist, basically all he was doing on the Pirates, as he compiled a 1.6 defensive WAR and a .936 fielding percentage during his time in Pittsburgh. And as he wanted more playing time, his request for a trade was granted after the 1978 season, when he was traded to the newly found Seattle Mariners during the winter meetings. And as his now former team would go on to win the World Series, 1979 would give him his most playing time. He appeared in 148 games at shortstop for the Mariners, thanks in part to them being one of the worst teams in the league. And just like 1977, he hit just below his line by hitting 198 with 1 home run, 3 stolen bases on 3 attempts, and a .466 OPS, while having a 1.3 defensive WAR and a .968 fielding percentage in 619 chances, both career highs for a full season. 1980 would be his best year at the plate, having a career high in average, on base, slugging, OPS, and home runs with 2 in 114 games. But he seemed to sacrifice some fielding ability for that little bit of offensive gain, as his defensive WAR and fielding percentage dropped. 1980 would be his last year in Seattle, before being traded to the Rangers for his final full season in the majors, as he had another solid year at the plate by his standards, as he also set a career high in defensive WAR at 1.4. But the reason his time in Seattle was so important to the story is this is where the term that Mendoza became associated with would originate. The common origin story is that George Brett told reporters in 1980, as he was in the midst of a slump, that the first thing I look for in the Sunday papers is who is below the Mendoza line, aka who is hitting below 200. While George Brett is a big part of the reason the term spread, according to Mendoza, he's not the one who coined the phrase. Mendoza said in 2011 that he was born during his first year at the Mariners in 1979. This would be his 4th season hitting under 200, and after he hit 198 at the season's end, he was just the 4th major leaguer to hit below 200 after playing at least 148 games. Mendoza told the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 2011, Tom Paciorek and Bruce Bochy used it to make fun of me. Then they were giving George Brett a hard time because he had a slow start to the year. So they told him, hey man, you're going to sink down below the Mendoza line if you're not careful. And then Brett mentioned it to Chris Berman from ESPN, and eventually it spread and became a part of the game. And that is really what happened. George Brett overheard the phrase being used, then told reporters about how he checked the papers to see who was below the Mendoza line, and Chris Berman and other ESPN reporters began using it to quickly describe how a hitter was doing. And it continued to grow from there. And funny enough, the same year the term started to grow, he had his best year at the plate as mentioned, hitting 45 points above the new measurement named after him, and that same year as George Brett neared the 400 line, manager Daryl Johnson mentioned that Mendoza took 3 hits away from Brett when they played each other in September. So I guess that's how we got back at him for helping Mendoza become baseball's biggest punchline. And there is an irony in the fact that Mendoza finished his major league career 15 points ahead of the 200 line. And he wasn't even the worst of his era, as Luis Pujols hit 193 in 9 seasons, the same amount of seasons Mendoza played. So we could easily be saying someone is below the Pujols line, although that sounds weird to say, and the 2022 Home Run Derby semifinalist would have ruined the joke anyway. But it is interesting to see now that the Mendoza line doesn't seem to be a part of the discussion today. Batting average isn't close to as relevant as it was in 1979, the year the Mendoza line was born, and it's seen the average stats of the league. In 1979 and 1980, the average league-wide was 265, and in 2023, it was 248, the 20th worst of all time, but actually 5 points higher than what it was in 2022, which was the 5th worst ever and the worst since 1967. It should also be noted that this was the last year of the shift, which at least explains the dip, and it goes even further looking at individual players. When Mendoza hit below 200 in 148 games in 1979, he was just the 4th player to ever do so, and now, it's happened 4 times in just the past 2 years. Trent Grisham and Geraldo Perdomo did so in 2022, and Grisham did again in 2023, along with Kyle Schwarber. And we can throw in Joey Gallo in 2021 for more in the last 3 years than there was for the first 76 years of Major League Baseball. And in Mendoza's career, he averaged 65 games a season, and in 1979, there were 5 position players who hit below 200 with at least 65 games played. And in 2023, there were 18, actually an improvement from the 28 who did so in 2022 and the 29 in 2021. It's not that the hitters are worse than they were in 1979, it's more the pitching is much better in the present day, and factor in analytics, and the now extinct shifts, and a change in philosophy where pure power hitters are seen as more valuable than the contact-only guys. But for Mario Mendoza, he was just at the wrong place at the wrong time for his name to be primarily associated with the basis of a well below average hitter. As mentioned, there were still a number of players in this time whose average was just as bad, and they weren't the type of defender that Mendoza was. But an inside joke leaked from outside the clubhouse, then George Brett mentioned it, and it snowballed from there. And it's even snowballed past the baseball world. The NFL version in the Dalton line has been a term used to measure if an NFL quarterback is a franchise QB, with the franchise QB term developing around the time that Dalton became one, and his play can be seen as the bare minimum for a franchise quarterback, although the Mendoza line isn't really seen as the bare minimum for a franchise player in baseball. A 2011 article looking at the US 10-year note yield declining below 2 described it as moving below the Mendoza line. Presidential approval ratings dropping below 30 can be seen as the Mendoza line of political polls. A movie having a below $2,000 box office per theater average is a Mendoza line of movies, which most movies are below nowadays, and various shows have referenced the term in their shenanigans. The term is one that became so normalized that it's easy to forget that the term references an actual player. Mendoza played his final season in the US in 1983 in AAA Hawaii, then went back to his home country Mexico, where he played and managed for 7 years, trying to pull the ball less and hitting .291 in those 7 years. He then came back in 1991 to work alongside Joe Madden in the Angels Instructional League, and to his surprise, the Mendoza term was widespread in the States. Mendoza would manage in the Angels farm system for the next 9 years, and he constantly had to deal with being asked about the term he's associated with from reporters and fans. And naturally, this bothered him. And there is a rumor that he even chased after someone who used the term in a way he didn't like, though Mendoza denies this ever happened. Players who played with Mendoza said they cringed years later when they heard the term because they knew the stigma he dealt with and the fact that many saw him as an excellent teammate and his defense overshadowed his hitting ability. And in this time, a shortstop who didn't hit a lot but was strong defenders weren't uncommon, with the likes of Mark Bellinger, Johnny LeMaster, and even someone like Ozzie Smith. And when you're only making pinch hit appearances and starting maybe once every other day, then it's much more of a challenge to stay consistent. That's not to say Mendoza's offense was his strength, as his one full year saw him hit just 198. But it is unfair that the weakest part of his game is basically what he's most remembered for. He in a sense is most remembered for being a meme before that was really a thing. Regardless, Mendoza still made it farther than any could dream of and helped revolutionize the shortstop position, and was able to turn his playing career into a decades-long coaching career that continues to this day as he manages in the Mexican League, where he is seen as a hero for overcoming the odds to make the majors and giving him an induction into the Mexican Professional Baseball Hall of Fame in 2000. And maybe it's good the Mendoza line is becoming less relevant as we focus more on the Rendon line, which measures the amount of a player gives, with 0 being the line. And if you want to know more about the lines players in the 70s and 80s were more focused on, then you can watch my video about the Pittsburgh drug trials, involving the lines of the Pittsburgh Parrot.